Our objective is to redefine the paradigm of engagement for businesses with external stakeholders, be it government, media, civil society, and academia. PAFI is dedicated to raise and maintain higher standards in public affairs, policy, public policy, and advocacy, and enable industry and businesses to achieve these and sustain these. So over the past 2 months, we've had the honor of hosting PAFI Dialogues with very eminent speakers. These include our Foreign Secretary, Mr. Harshvardhan Shringla, Secretary Electronics and IT, Mr. Ajay Soni, National Cyber Security Coordinator, Lieutenant General Dr. Rajesh Pant, NHA CEO Dr. R.S. Sarma, the man also behind the COVID app, and of course, Dr. Junaid Ahmed, Country Director of the World Bank. Now, today's PAFI Dialogue is amazing. It's special for reasons more than one. One, we are doing it on a Thursday and not our usual Friday. And two, we have two very eminent speakers. And third, which is really significant in today's geopolitics, is that this discussion today is centered around a book published almost half a century after the July 1971 so-called secret visit to China by Henry Kissinger, the then National Security Advisor in the US. Many believe it created a paradigm shift, not just in the bilateral relations between the US and China, but has kind of laid the foundation of emergence of China the way we see it today as an economic and increasingly a political superpower, and has caused and is still causing tectonic shifts across geopolitics, trade, technology, and much, much more. Now, the book, A New Cold War, Henry Kissinger and the Rise of China, is a collection of essays contributed by experts from 10 countries. You couldn't get it better. It has been edited by Sanjay Baru and Rahul Sharma, both eminent co-editors who are with us today. Thank you for being with us today. We are really fortunate that this dialogue is being moderated by none other than Nitin Pai. And before Nitin, I pass it on to you, I'd like to just give a very brief introduction of who you are. I'm sure people know, but just my job to do this now. So Nitin is the co-founder and director of the Takshashila Institution, which is an independent networked public policy think tank. A gold medalist at Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, Nitin has spent more than a decade with the Singapore government shaping its media and communication strategies in the age of internet and social media, much before he relocated to India in 2012 to pursue his passion with the Takshashila project. Nitin is a columnist with The Mint. Love the way you write, Nitin. And his articles have been published in a number of national and international publications. Nitin, thank you for being there and for carrying on this conversation with both Sanjay and with Rahul. This will be for about half an hour, after which we'll have our audience pose questions for, say, about 20 minutes. And before we start, just a few important housekeeping announcements. We have the opportunity to request questions from you, but please put them only in the Q&A box and not in the chat box. And the fun part begins now. Two best questions from the audience would be chosen by Nitin, and they would receive a complimentary copy of the book. And of course, I'll request the managing committee members of PAFI, the founders, the staff, not to pose their questions. We presume that you know a lot more about India and China and the geopolitics. So with this, I'm going to hand over to Nitin, and Nitin, it's all yours today.
Thank you. Thank you, Vinita. Thank you, Deepak. Thanks for those generous words of introduction. But I'm not going to do that with Rahul Sharma and Sanjay Baru. I mean, these guys really don't need any introduction. I'll be showing my own ignorance if I go ahead and read out their bios. So, but what I want to tell you is that both these gentlemen have been quite naughty in this business of international relations. So in their own ways, they've shaped international relations, India's foreign policy, in ways that probably the book doesn't reveal, because in the book, they are pretending to be scholars, journalists, etc., and not players in their own right. But let me assure you that these two naughty and mischievous gentlemen have done a lot to promote India's interests in our neighborhood and beyond, and including with the great powers. But some of those stories, we'll see if they have the enthusiasm and the inclination, they'll tell us today if we have the time also. But, back to today's topic. It's almost like 50 years have passed. Nobody sort of realized that this is, doesn't seem to be this conversation about Kissinger in China at all. Until one Mr. Sharma and one Mr. Dr. Baru decide to write a book about it and enlist Ocean's 10. So there are 10 other people who've written about it. And it's a fantastic volume. I went through it briefly. I read some chapters in greater detail than others, but I couldn't find anything of that nature which has come out anywhere in the world. So it's unique in the world today, and the kind of interest and sort of foresight the editors had in bringing out this volume is just amazing. So those of you who have not yet picked up the book, please do so after the event. I mean, you might have a small chance of winning the book, a free copy, but otherwise you should go and get this. It's extremely important to read. Now, I'll just make a couple of minutes of some early comments just to trigger this conversation off, and then invite the two gentlemen to weigh in. But the whole idea of Nixon in China, Kissinger and Nixon in China in 1971, seen from an Indian prism, got lost in a lot of other things. And it got lost in our own interpretation of our place in the world, our relations with the United States, etc. And we sort of missed the geopolitical plot here. Right? We were saying, Nixon is this bad guy. He said nasty things to Indira Gandhi. Kissinger, encouraged Pakistan, and USS Enterprise came in the Bay of Bengal during the Bangladesh War, and so on. So our entire prism was seen from a very insular, looking at our insecurities, and then looking at great powers and geopolitics in that sense. I wouldn't blame us for doing that, because 50 years ago was a different country. People of my generation have been fortunate to have been part of the story of an India that is a rising and a growing power. But in 1971, we were in a very different kind of situation. But even so, I think we missed that plot then. And the whole idea of Kissinger and China and what it means for us only became relevant to us again in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, when there was a dramatic shift occurring in the global balance of power, because we saw ourselves as one of the rising powers. We were being compared with China as a rising power. The balance of power, global power, was shifting to the east. And this United States was engaged in a very complex relationship with China. Those of us, including Rahul and Baru, saw that the United States is doing something very stupid by indulging China, and is going to come back and bite you. But nobody in Washington did. So for the large part, we were like looking at these guys and saying, you guys don't know what you're doing. You're feeding your own adversary. But that, in the last 5 years, changed dramatically. And under Trump, for all the criticism and bad mouthing the Trump administration gets and Donald Trump himself gets, one thing which he got really right was he saw that China is a strategic adversary, and the United States therefore needs to confront it. And there seems to be an evolving bipartisan consensus in the United States that this is the case. So in that sense, it's a big, circle from 1971 to 2017, 2018 under Trump, where, the US policy has sort of made a turn. Now, where it will go after this, we don't know, right? Because it could go back towards that, or it could go in some other direction, but that's in our hands. Now, a few words about Kissinger. Whether you like the guy or dislike the guy, right? Chris Hitchens has a wonderful book called The Trial of Henry Kissinger, where he indicts Kissinger for war crimes and a whole lot of things. Whether you're in the Hitchens camp, or whether in all these bunch of adulatory scholars who like Kissinger, whether you admire the guy or criticize him, whether you think he's wrong or he's right, you can't ignore the man. And he has played an outsized role in world affairs in the last 50 to 70 years. And for given his background, given his academic background, and how he entered the US political system and as a global statesman by sheer dint of his intellect, I think that is something remarkable. And there can be no better way to dissect his, the consequences of his actions than the authors in this volume who've looked at it from several directions and talked about it. Now, for us, it's a question of, are these things structural or are they agency? In the sense that were there no Kissinger? Were geopolitical events such that the United States and China would come together somewhere in the 1970s, if not in 71, maybe in 75, maybe 80, is that an issue of structure? Similarly, if Jaswant Singh and Strobe Talbot hadn't had those conversations, would India and the United States have come together in the way they did during Barugaru's time in government? Jury is out, but there is something to the structural theory, because interests are what they are, and when interests converge, you set aside historical differences and then try and create a new path. But also the fact that you need the right people in the right place, because it's very easy to blow chances. We in India know this very well. We know how to, we can probably write 10 volumes on how to miss opportunities, right? So, but that's important. And 1979 Iran, Berlin Wall 1989, 9/11, and then Trump in 2018. All of these have been massive watershed moments in our history. But I think modern way of understanding our place in the world really starts with 1971 and Nixon visit to China. So that's my little preface. But what I would do now is I would ask to both Barugaru and Mr. Sharma to speak for about 5 to 10 minutes on their personal impressions about the concept in the book and of the writing of the book, because there are also very interesting people who are part of the assembly of scholars who wrote this book. So how was it to bring together people like this to write a book like this, and what do you think of the substantial arguments which you're making in that book? Either of you. I think maybe we'll go with Barugaru first.
Okay, Nitin, thank you very much. You spoke about my mischief. Well, you are a product of my mischief. I often think that one of the sensible things I did was to encourage you to leave Singapore and come back to India. And you have enormously contributed to the nature of discourse on geopolitics in this country. And so I will take some credit for your success. But having said that, I should now give all the credit for this book to Rahul, because the idea was Rahul's. The idea was not mine. One day we met and he said, look, next year is going to be the 50th anniversary of 1971. Why don't we put together a book on this? And the minute he said that to me, I immediately understood it is a fantastic idea, and therefore I'm glad you make the point that nobody else has thought of this. Certainly Rahul did, and then we sat down and drew up a list. The list was drawn from 2 points of view. We wanted, of course, an Indian viewpoint to be the dominant viewpoint. So we have a lot of Indian heads of various think tanks in Delhi. But apart from that, we wanted a view from some of the countries that were involved. Russia for one, Japan, Pakistan, United States, Australia. So we put together a set of names. We actually approached a few others, particularly from the US, but those who had the time and the willingness to write in a very quick period of time. I think, I forget now, but I think we wrote emails to all these authors somewhere around probably say, October last year. Not even 1 year since we thought of the book. And then everybody delivered an essay in time. Nobody took more time than necessary. And then the publishers were very efficient in putting it out. So it's quite rare for a book to be conceived, planned, delivered, published within less than 1 year, which is the story of this book. And therefore, I must compliment Swati Chopra and her team at HarperCollins also for that. Very quickly, I would summarize the book in terms of the issues. Well, again, before I do that, I must say one more thing, which I noted down, that it's odd that we are gathering on the platform of a public affairs forum rather than some usual standard geopolitical think tank. but actually it's very appropriate because Henry Kissinger should be the kind of a symbol of success of public affairs. And as the most successful American lobbyist, has become a billionaire probably lobbying for various companies. So all members of PAFI should read Kissinger's life and see how he converted his intellectual knowledge of the world into a money-making enterprise, which very few of us have been able to do in our lifetime. But Kissinger was a successful lobbyist. And in many ways, that's the kind of question that this book raises, and that a lot of people have asked: was Kissinger a strategist or was he a lobbyist? In other words, was this outreach to China a product of very profound strategic thinking, very clever strategic thinking? Or did he understand the nature of the Chinese economy, the market, the 1 billion people, opportunities for the US, and was he opening up? And certainly, even if the geopolitical factor was important to begin with, I think within the first 2 decades, particularly after Deng Xiaoping introduced reforms, I mean, Deng was a turning point for China. And I think once Kissinger understood what Deng was up to, American business moved in a big way. And Kissinger continues to play. He continues to play even now this role of a lobbyist for American business. Now, very quickly, the 3 themes of this book, and then I'll hand it over to Rahul. First and foremost, I think one set of essays in this book, which includes Rana Mitter, Teresita Schaefer, Frederick Rar, Bill Emmert, many of them make the point that 1971 was inevitable. That it had to happen. In other words, that the United States had to come to terms with China, had to recognize China, that Taiwan being China was odd, that at some point of time or the other, this change had to happen. And Nixon and Kissinger were the gentlemen who effected it. So there's a set of essays that talk about the inevitability. In fact, I think Rana Mitter says it could have happened even earlier, and he gives various opportunities when it could have happened, the recognition of China, but finally it happened in 71. Of course, the received wisdom on this has been that it was in response to the US worries about USSR. And there I must add that a lot of younger people today do not understand this. They think, what was America worried about the Soviet Union? People forget that in the 1960s, 70s, the Soviet Union was a rising power. That it was in fact seen as far more successful in its geopolitical strategies than the United States. The Soviet Union had more friends in the world than the United States. The United States had to be actually bribing people with arms and investment, while the Soviet Union was making friends simply with its ideology and outreach. So, one should not forget that the 70s, 60s and 70s was a decade when the Soviet Union was a formidable power. Nevertheless, I think there is a view that many of us in India have, that going this far of actually empowering China in the way the US did, particularly, I mean, not in 71, but particularly after 80s and after the end of the Cold War, was very self-serving. The second set of arguments we tried to put together in the book are country-specific. So how did it affect Japan, for example? Kikuchi has an excellent article on how Japan was impacted by the US decision, because after all, Japan was a major US ally next door to China. How was Russia affected? Suhasini Haidar has an excellent chapter on how South Asia was impacted. And she raises the very interesting question, suppose Kissinger had not taken off from Islamabad to go to Beijing, but had actually taken off from Finland or Romania or some other country, would it have made that kind of a difference to South Asia? Because in a sense, Pakistan became a major factor as a consequence of this, etc., etc. And finally, a third set of questions we look at is really not about 1971, but after. And my own essay is looking at the nature of the economic partnership, the geoeconomics of the relationship, which, as I said, did not begin in 71, 71 to the mid 80s was a different kind of relationship with geopolitics dominated that equation. But certainly once Deng Xiaoping was on the scene and the and then the economic liberalization and opening up of China began, the US quickly understood the nature of the opportunity. And then I argue, of course, in my own essay, and I think there are a few other who make this point, including Rahul, which is that it was the US outreach to China that played an important role in the rise of China. And that, this is a classic example of what Marx very famously said, about the bourgeoisie, that they create their own instruments of destruction, or they create the instruments of their own destruction. The United States, in a sense, created the instrument of its own destruction. Thank you very much.
Mr. Sharma, over to you.
Thank you. I think Sanjay has given the whole picture of what the book is all about. I'll talk about a few other things. The idea, where it came from, and how it sort of got built up before I say a few other things. I remember I moved to Hong Kong sometime in the mid 90s, as a journalist, and China was then a very different country. It was of course growing, and at some point in time, soon after we landed in Hong Kong, my wife and I decided to travel to China. But there was a slight problem. I had a journalist visa stamped in my passport, and that made my travel to China difficult because they would not allow journalists. So anyway, we trotted off to the China Tourist Agency or something it was called in Hong Kong. And I had a conversation with the man across the desk, and I said, we want to go. He looked at my passport, he said, and gave me a pink form and said, fill it up. So I said, what do I put as my profession? He said, put manager. So I said, okay. And I said, what about my wife? He said, put secretary. I said, okay. So obviously in those days, a lot of managers in Hong Kong traveled, to Shenzhen and other places. Anyway, so we tootled off to Guangzhou, and then at some point we did a train journey from Shanghai to Hangzhou, and you realize that this was a country which was really, really large, with a lot more people than India was, and that was where my fascination for China actually started, and I started looking at it. The second thing that triggered the idea was sometime when I lived in Singapore, I decided to do my master's, and I went off to Fletcher in the US and sat in a class that was about US foreign policy and Kissinger. And somewhere along the way, it all started coming together, how it all started. And, going back to what Sanjay said, whether Kissinger was a statesman, whether he was a foreign policy realist who really looked at the world differently, or he was eventually a lobbyist, I think he played all the roles. But it's quite clear that he had a very important role to play in the formulation of US foreign policy in many ways. But it didn't stop with that. I think, and what I talk about in my essay, it continued even after he left the government. And he left the government in, even before the US and China got into formal, diplomatic relationship. It happened only in '79. But his connect with the Chinese and the trust that Chinese had in him, because for several reasons, Chinese are like that in many ways, ensured that he continued to play a role, whether it was from a business point of view, and the idea for the book actually came from, a Zoom call, which I was having with some like-minded people, and we were discussing about various things that happened in the 70s. I don't know why we were discussing that, but of course, 71 came in, and then we talked about 1973 oil crisis, and then we went on to talk about 79, which was a very critical year, from an Islamic point of view, because there was the attack on Mecca, there was the overthrow of Shah of Iran, and then eventually there was the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan at the end of 1979. So it all sort of built this whole thing together. But what I remembered when I was in Hong Kong was something a gentleman with both of you are well aware of, a gentleman called Lee Kuan Yew, the former Prime Minister of China. In 1993, and he was a man of great foresight and insight. In 1993, he said, China's displacement of the world balance was such that the world must find a new balance in the next 30, 40 years. Now, he's saying that in 1993, and we are today, almost there, 30 years on, that we are sitting in the situation where we're asking ourselves, what do we do with China? And the other interesting thing he said at that point in time, it is not possible, I'm quoting him here, it is not possible to pretend that this is just another big player. This is the biggest player in the history of the world. Did he get it right? Probably yes. Seeing where China stands today, seeing the kind of challenges it's throwing up to the world, we are in a position where we really don't know where to go with China, because we have a scenario where the current leadership is probably going to, go beyond the usual 10 years, just like his predecessor. And it is definitely a much more assertive nation than it was when Deng was around. Deng used to talk about peaceful rise, but she's not talking about peaceful rise. He's talking about, a very muscular rise. China is big, it's strong, it's got the money, it's got the muscles. It wants to rule the world probably. So I think within these contexts, if you see this, the where the book is coming from, it weaves in a lot of layers from perspective of, where the world is, and from the perspective of different countries that the book is looking at. So, and we were lucky to get a lot of very good contributors, very, very good contributors who have very deep knowledge of, China. So Kissinger is 50 years, like every anniversary became a kind of a, something to weave a story around. And so there we have, and we have this book,
Fantastic book.
Which is,
but Rahul, if I were to, usually what happens in conversations like this is, what does this mean for the future, right? But let's not get there, because I think there's a whole lot of people talking about what does this mean for the future. I just want to take you to connect this audience to this book, right? Let's say we were public affairs people, corporate executives dealing with governments in India and abroad in the 70s, okay, late 60s, early 70s. I was, of course, not even conceived at that time, but I suppose you gentlemen were. So you probably have memories of that period. So what would that executive who's in the corporate comms, public affairs role in a corporation, Indian or a multinational corporation, what would that person have? How would that person have oriented himself or herself? Knowing that all these things are happening. You're in 1970, 1971. There's this talk of Kissinger doing this. The Soviet Union and the UN, there's a balance of power. Like, what do I do? I mean, as a corporate executive, what do I do? What does it mean for me? How would you answer that?
I think, just going back to, what Sanjay was talking about, I think the world, it was different, but from a very business point of view, it was about business, and that's what happened. Americans looked at China as a huge opportunity, as a huge place. And, I think Sanjay makes a very interesting point where, there was no trade unionism in China, right? There was, he makes it, there was this massive workforce that was available for cheap, where people would go set up production and buy stuff for cheap and make huge profits. So I think if you look at it, if I were at that point in time, I would be doing probably exactly what I'm doing now, which is trying to connect the dots and see what is the most beneficial direction for me to go. And what is it that I'm going to get out? Because if I am working for a corporate, I'm obviously looking for profits and looking to ensure that, I keep my costs down. And therefore, China was a great place to go to.
Yeah. So, I think it's very, very important, as I said earlier, to remember that this China as a business destination is post Deng Xiaoping. So this, if you look at the last 50 years, there is 71 to about mid-80s, and then there is mid-80s till now, or rather till about 5 years back, before Trump came. Now, in 71, when Kissinger did this, the story of the day was the Cold War and the Soviet Union. That's why I keep emphasizing, particularly to young people these days, that please don't forget that there was something called the Cold War, there was the Soviet Union, and the West was shit scared of them because they thought the whole world was going to become communist. And we were with the Soviets. And America was enemy country. It's not often remembered. So 71, what defined 71 was the Cold War and the Soviet Union. So, but what actually turned out for the US as a smart thing to have done, they understood only in the 80s when China opened up. Because then suddenly they realized, then Kissinger personally realized, and the United States as a nation realized, that the investment they made in 71 is going to pay off. I don't think in 71 they invested in the China thinking it will pay off. I think they invested in China thinking that was necessary to take advantage of the Sino-Soviet split and to take on the Soviet Union. But by the mid-80s, they suddenly realized it was a very smart investment, and they fully encashed that investment. I mean, the American economy benefited enormously from the China connection and so on and so forth. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think we have to make this distinction between 71 till really the Deng reforms took effect. And then the post-Deng era and the US-China relationship. There are two different things happening. And as I keep saying, Kissinger was the smart strategist who didn't think he would make millions out of what he was doing in 71. But the minute he realized he could make his millions, made his millions.
That's I think just wanted to add something. I think, 80s, again, I mean, when 89, the Tiananmen Square thing happened, I think Americans took a pause. They were jolted. They didn't know how to deal with this. Here they were on a very roller coaster ride, looking at creating business opportunities, building and hoping that, of course, one day China would become like them, which is never going to happen. But 1989, they were jolted by what happened. They didn't know how to deal with it. And in fact, it was very interesting to see, even at that point, Nixon and Kissinger both actually traveled to China to have back-end conversations to try and see what kind of a deal could be struck. But after that, it was all business, because you had Clinton come in and then the whole WTO thing happened. And after that, there's been no end to it, to be honest.
Okay. Rahul, I'll ask you a quick question before I take the audience questions.
Sure.
Now, you're this guy who's been in a journalist job, a corporate job, public affairs, also with a deep interest in international relations, geopolitics, right? What would you say, if you're a public affairs person, what should you be looking out for in international relations, geopolitics? Why does that concern you as a public affairs person?
It concerns me because eventually, like I said earlier, it concerns me because it impacts my business. If I'm working for, if I'm working for a corporate, if I'm trying to influence policy, if I'm trying to bring about certain changes in the way governments think and look at trade issues, look at several other issues, it eventually all boils down to bilateral relationships between nations. It eventually boils down on how nations present themselves in the large groupings and what is it that they have to say, which is going to impact everything that happens back end. So it's very important to know what's happening in the world, because today, and it's always been. Earlier we didn't know very much in quick time. Now we know everything very, very quickly. So I'll just give you an example. I was at one point in time, there's a large pharma company, and a bunch of their public affairs people were in India, and I was asked to make a presentation to them. And this was soon after Trump had become president. And I asked them one question. I said, are you guys following Trump on Twitter? And they said, no. And I said, well, let's be realistic here. I think all of you should be, because you don't know what he's going to say and what he's going to do. If he's going to say something on Twitter, which is going to impact you and you're going to wake up completely shocked, how is it going to happen? I think it's going back to what I said earlier. It's so important in public affairs, in policy making, to be able to connect the dots, not only at the local end, but also globally. So when you see all large multinationals who have very large public affairs teams, they are trying to figure out what's happening in the world and how it's going to impact them.
Okay.
And that is what makes it important to know, why international relations matter.
Right. So there is a question from an anonymous attendee, which I think Marugaru has already answered, but I think you could answer it some length. Because it says, given how the world turned out, should we not be reassessing Kissinger and downgrade his positioning as a great strategist? And this is a very, very interesting question, right? Because in the short term, he got 30 years of brilliant success for the United States, but in the process, bred both irritating short-term rival, which did 9/11 to them, and also a long-term strategic rival who's challenging them for primacy. So, how would you? Maybe we should get Barugaru to jump on this. How do you rate this guy? Was this guy overrated?
Well, certainly. I mean, I think that's why I keep saying Kissinger was fantastic at marketing himself, and so he created a global persona around himself, around his thinking. But we cannot dilute the fact that he was a great scholar. Anyone who has read anything that Kissinger has written will be impressed by scholarship. His books are extremely scholarly. I've read his book on diplomacy. I've read his book on China, and I've read his book on the New World Order. I've not read his original book on European history, but all of them are very, very. So therefore, he was a great intellectual. But the question we are asking is, as a strategist, as a policymaker, did he have an exaggerated image? I think so. And you mentioned Hitchin's accusation about his role in the Vietnam War, etc. And certainly in the United States, there has been a reassessment of Kissinger. But again, I keep thinking that, and maybe this point didn't come through very clearly in our book, which is that there is 1971, and then there is the 1980s, Tiananmen, post-Tiananmen. The US benefited enormously from what it did with respect to China in the 70s, in the 80s, and even till the turn of the century. I think the real problem is that the US was slow in recognizing how China was simply taking off. The enormous transfer of technology that was happening directly from American companies in China to Chinese experts, but also from the United States to China. So this transfer of technology through companies and through human beings, I think the United States simply didn't wake up to it. Or even if it did, the greed of profit-making companies, which we see even today. I mean, even today you see in the United States how corporate America's views are so different. Just the other day, we had a news report how corporate America is asking Biden, to quieten down, all this anti-China stuff. And let's get back to business. Let's do more business with China. So the corporate greed, I think, just simply took over the US thinking. And strategic thinking was then, interpreted as if it was some great thing. But actually, companies think for themselves. I mean, we should be fools if we think that companies, when they talk about national interests, are actually talking about national interests. They are thinking of the corporate bottom line.
Yeah. So, I just want to come in and take a stab at this. One thing which I noticed from reading Kissinger's books, articles, etc., is that this guy was steeped in the European and Western tradition of international relations. Westphalian tradition, sees himself as operating in the Westphalian tradition. And along come these guys called China, who see things and think of themselves as a middle kingdom. There's no other sovereign, there's Tianxia, the way they look at the world, the way they look at the game of international relations is very different. And Kissinger didn't get that until his most recent book called On China, where he sort of tries to say that, this is what, presents it as a sort of a big revelation that this is how the Chinese think. But the Chinese have been thinking like this for ages. I mean, they could have talked to us, we would have told them, or Vietnamese would have told them, anybody in Southeast Asia would have told them. But I think Kissinger's blind spot was really that he was thinking that he was playing chess with the Chinese, but they were playing some other game, you know. But the board sort of looked the same, but the game was very different and the moves were different. So that's it. I'll ask Rahul this. There's a question from Vinita, which doesn't qualify for the free gift for the book. So it's a non-qualifying question, but it's interesting. So I'm going to ask it. But this is, what if this guy Kissinger were to make a visit to China tomorrow? What would he ask them? What would he try to do?
Well, I don't think any different. I mean, I don't think he's going to ask anything different than he has been asking for the last so many years. In the sense, it's something very interesting happened. So, on this 50th anniversary of his visit, you didn't see anything coming out of US, but there was actually a felicitation in China, at which Kissinger spoke via video. I mean, he's 98 years old. I mean, he's not getting any younger. And I think his standard line has been that, you need to find a way to work together, etc., etc. And I don't think that's going to be any different, because eventually, at this point in time, too, he is probably looking at his own interest, right? I mean, he's gone beyond, the national scene. I mean, the reality is that every Chinese president, and Nitin, correct me if I'm wrong, every Chinese president has sought Kissinger's advice at every point in time in relation with the United States. When Trump started throwing a tantrum and started making things very difficult for China, Chinese again reached out to Kissinger, and Kissinger tried to do something, but he was dealing with a very different administration and he could not find a wire media for that. But again, the reality is that despite all that, despite what happened during Trump's time, etc., it's very difficult to separate the two countries because they are so enjoined here from a commercial and from an economic point of view, that probably Kissinger would not be asking for anything different than what he has been.
Kissinger plays for himself. Oisin Dasgupta has a very nice question, which I think both of you should answer. And this is also something after my own heart, because he talks about triangular diplomacy. For those who might not follow this, it's like saying the United States should have better relationships with the Soviet Union and China than they have with each other. Or like how I've argued that in the past, right? In 2010, I argued, for example, that India should have better relations with the United States and China than they have with each other. So that would give us the kind of power. Now, I don't think that kind of an argument makes sense, because Xi Jinping has single-handedly told us that he doesn't want to be friends with us. So, if you push us to this side, then we'll operate from this side, right? So, but anyway, do you think that the Kissinger doctrine, triangular diplomacy kind of ideas are still effective in the world today? Baru?
Well, first of all, very quickly on your earlier question on Kissinger as a European looking at the world, I in fact think there's something there. This obsession with the Soviet Union is a very European obsession. And the desire of the Americans to continue to dominate Western Europe, where the only threat is Soviet Union, or was Soviet Union, now Russia. China was never an issue there. So they were, this old classic thing, enemy's enemy is my friend, or my neighbor's neighbor is my friend. So for the United States and Western Europe, because Russia was a bigger issue. And therefore, reaching out to China was seen as a natural thing to do. And I think that thinking dominated. But on this question, on triangular, you see, Kissinger was operating, well, first of all, in 1971, there were two powers, and Kissinger understood the potential of a third power altering the equation, right? So Soviet Union and China were allies, in the communist countries were allies in the immediate post-Second World War period, after 1950, after Korean War, till the 60s, till there was a war between China and the Soviet Union. And the minute that happened, and I think this point is made in several of the essays, particularly Teresita Schaefer's essay, that the minute China and the US began fighting with China and USSR began fighting with each other, US woke up and said, hi, those two guys are fighting, now let me go and become friends with one of them in order to settle my problem with the other. And that is how the reach outreach to China happened. But if you look at the world today, it's a very different world. You know what you said, Nitin, that we thought of ourselves as China, US, India, three triangular. That is no longer true. I mean, we had that hope about 10 years back, certainly, and if you did write that in 2010, you are writing in the correct year. Because in 2010, I was involved in a triangular dialogue between China, US, and India. We had Center for Policy Research, Shyam Saran, Pratap Bhanu Mehta, and I were going from India, Strobe Talbot and Martin Indyk from US, and the Kikir director and his colleagues from China. 9 of us met once in Beijing, once in Washington, once in Delhi, to talk about this triangle, right? But even in 2010, the Chinese were laughing at it. There was a young Chinese on Chinese side who said, I can understand America and China sitting across the table and talking about the future, but what the hell is India doing here? And today the Chinese will not even come for a trilateral dialogue. They say, what is a trilateral? I mean, America is number 1, we are number 2. We are rising, they are falling. India kahan hai? So that moment is gone for us. It may come back, but for that to come back, the Indian economy has to go from being less than 3 trillion, which you are now, to becoming at least 6 trillion, 8 trillion. I mean, let us focus on where we are. And the illusion somehow that we are the 3 great nations, the 3 great powers, of course, we are no longer in that league. And the Chinese have put us in our place.
Exactly. That's exactly what I meant by saying we've lost many opportunities. I just want to take one question before we hand it back, because we have closed. There are plenty of nice questions, but not enough time as usual. But this thing of Deng reforms and America, and I think you pointed out that it was Singapore. Deng and China learned the method from Singapore rather than from the United States. I just want to tell you a little bit. I used to work for the Singapore government in the late 90s. And every other week rather, this is not hyperbole, every other week, we would have visitors coming in from China. These would be government officials from various levels, different parts. They would be provincial guys, they would be national level guys. They would have a sort of a tour of Singapore. And it's not a junket. These guys knew exactly which government body to go, whom to meet, what questions to ask. And, it almost, at one point, I assembled a FAQ. I said, this is an FAQ, guys, you take this. You don't have to ask us this every time. But that was how they did it. Methodical understanding of how Singapore does. This is governance and public, civil service. But they also took the lesson from Lee Kuan Yew in terms of political transition. And how do you ensure that there is a political transition in a one-party state and ensure that good people rise to the top? And I have huge amounts of complaints and criticisms of the Chinese state and the model. But what they've managed to do is that leadership, to rise in the leadership, you have to show competence. You have to demonstrate that you are able to achieve results in a viciously competitive, politically competitive atmosphere. It is a pit of snakes. Snakes are biting each other, but you still have to govern amid snakes who are trying to bite you. And it does throw up some good people onto the top. Definitely not a model for us. I wouldn't wish that model on anybody else in the world, but well, to the extent that it does bring up good people. So I don't know whether you want to comment on Deng and how he, picked up various things from around the world.
Very briefly, there's one question whether the Chinese were learning from America in whatever they were doing. And I wrote the answer and exactly said, you elaborated on that, which is that actually they were learning from Singapore. The Chinese were learning from Singapore for a very simple reason, that Singapore was also developing rapidly. So a lot of developmental experience was there in Singapore, but Singapore was not a multi-party democracy. It was a one-party state. And so was China. So I think the role model for China was really Singapore. And I can share here that when Manmohan Singh was going to China for the first time, and he wanted to understand China because he was not very familiar with China. The person he reached out to for tuition was Lee Kuan Yew. He spent a lot of time with Lee Kuan Yew saying, you tell me, you teach me, what is China all about. Lee Kuan Yew understood China, the Chinese understood Lee Kuan Yew. And I think, therefore, Singapore was a role model for China. And they have created 1.3 billion people.
Singaporeans.
Rahul, you want to comment on?
No, I complete agreement. I think US was they had to sort of make sure that they got to that level, but the learnings are coming from some other place, just like what you said, Singapore.
So thank you. I think we'll before I hand it over to Deepak, I just want to make a close bracket comment in the sense that I think a lot of us, whether we are in business or in strategic affairs, journalism, the tendency to look at our own navel and appreciate it for inordinately long amounts of time is just so inbuilt among us. So in the sense that we miss the opportunities and the threats which are happening around the world, 1971 being one, 2021 being another, in the sense that massive shifts happening in the relations of the great powers, in the way Xi Jinping is destroying single-handedly the formula which Deng Xiaoping used towards the growth of China. So, for example, if we believe that this is the beginning of the end of China, how do we, beginning of the end of China's rise? Then how do we, position ourselves as companies, as individuals, as India? So I think we've got to put a lot more of thought into that. Stop looking at domestic news and Twitter and look at international relations and see where it's going. Starting with a very important book brought out by Mr. Sharma and Dr. Baru. A pleasure to have had this conversation with you gentlemen this afternoon. And I would hand it over to Deepak to do the honors.
Thank you, Nitin.
Thank you, Nitin. Thanks.
Thanks, Nitin, and thank you, Dr. Baru and Rahul, for making time for discussion, for joining us today. Of course, we had the pleasure of having Dr. Baru several times, and Rahul, of course, has been also a co-founder of PAFI and also a past president. So welcome home in a way. And so the way we sort of looked at the whole thing, and this also reminded me of something else which we had heard from Dr. Baru 5 years back. So she had written a book at that point of time, which was started with another sort of a year, 1991, which was, of course, how Mr. PV Narasimha Rao became the prime minister and how he did several other things. So that was another interesting thing. And when you were talking about 1971, the year that came to my mind was 1991, recalling your book cover of that one. So another connection there. And thanks, Nitin, for sort of teasing out these different issues, the way you sort of maneuvered around different angles of geopolitics and also the trade, economy, and business, investment, etc. And of course, you did mention that both these gentlemen are quite naughty, but at the same time, I would say that this particular book, if you see, so not as NAUGHTY, but this book actually unties a whole lot of knots as KNOTTY in terms of these type of international relations and the type of complex world that we have been living, and we will continue to sort of living that sort of a complexity. But within that complexity, this particular book does make a lot of clarity. It brings a lot of clarity to different issues and makes not really recommendations on what specific choices are, but more importantly, it also tells us what the implications and what are the likely resistance or any implications or anything like that might happen in this particular discourse. So with that, we would also like to thank HarperCollins, the publishers of this book, who have agreed to sort of give away a couple of books. And one of the winners is Oishik. And so Nitin, do you have any other recommendation? I would leave that for you to announce the second winner. So one is Oishik, and Oishik will contact you separately. We'll take the address from you, and you'll get the book delivered at the particular address. So it is a physical copy. We are not just talking about an ebook version. So Nitin, anybody else?
Yeah, I would nominate anonymous attendee, the anonymous attendee who asked the question. Given about whether Kissinger is overrated,
Okay.
I think so. Whoever that anonymous attendee is.
So this is the last
time. The attendee has to go public first.
So this is yes.
We'll use Pegasus to find out.
Yes. Sometimes you have to give in a little bit of privacy to get something. Sometimes, but beyond that,
we will have several anonymous attendees now.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. And second thing I just wanted to mention was a little bit about PAFI itself. So right now we are just a couple of months away from our annual forum, which is the 8th National Forum coming up on October 21 and 22. The agenda is already shaping up pretty well. So all of you, I would request you to please keep a watch on our communications as well as on our website for the updates. And PAFI is able to host these type of discussions as well as the events and other things with support from all our members. So this is also a request to all the people from corporates who have joined here, who are not yet members. So please consider joining PAFI as a member and supporting our national event as well. So with that, let me sign off today. And also thanks to Ajay, Vinitha, and everybody else at PAFI. Also Lakshmi, my colleague, who has managed all the backend for bringing up this whole thing together. And with this, let me sign off and look forward to seeing all of you at the next PAFI Dialogue as well as some other discussion.